One of my favorite hymns is written by St. Francis of Assisi in the middle of the 13th century, and it's called the Canticle of Creation. St. Francis of Assisi was known to be someone who looked and found the presence of God all around him, particularly in creation. And given that this is our first introduction to imaginative prayer, I think it's important to point out that in this hymn or song written by St. Francis, he's making use of a great deal of his imagination by imagining that God is not only the creator, but the parent of all creation. The creation canticle of St. Francis goes like this. Be praised, good Lord, for brother sun, who brings us each new day. Be praised for sister moon, white, beauty bright and fair. With wondering stars she moves through the night. Be praised, my Lord, for brother wind, for air and clouds in the skies of every season. Be praised for sister water, humble, helpful, precious, pure. She cleanses us in rivers and renews us in rain. Be praised, my Lord, for brother fire. He purifies and enlightens us. Be praised, my Lord, for Mother Earth, abundant source, all life sustaining. She feeds us bread and fruit and gives us flowers. Be praised, my Lord, for the gift of life, for changing dusk and dawn, for touch and scent and song. Be praised, my Lord, for those who pardon one another for love of thee, and endure sickness and tribulation. Blessed are they who shall endure in it, for they shall be crowned by thee. Be praised, good Lord, for sister death, who welcomes us in loving embrace. Be praised, my Lord, for all your creation, serving you joyfully. I love that St. Francis finds the presence of God wherever he looks, and I love his playfulness in imagining the sun and the moon as brother and sister. Theologian Norman Wurzba says that creation is the visual, fragrant, audible, touchable, and tasteable manifestation of God's love, the place where God's desire that others be and be well finds earthly expression. I think one of the most undervalued prayer postures towards God is the posture towards God in prayer that recognizes and relishes in the reality that God is not stingy, but he's generous. Think about how many things exist in the world, how many beautiful things there are that draw our attention towards them. The flowers in your garden, the breeze on a fall day in the Midwest, the cold waters of Lake Superior, the millions of species of animals that float and fly, and everything exists to shine forth the love and the creativity and the kindness of God. Everything is a gift. There are endless items and pleasure and goodness and beauty in the world, and God loves all of them. There are so many things that God loves. And my heart for you and my desire for you and your children is that there would be a consistent recognition that there is so much beauty in the world that flows from God and from who he is. The theological work that this first prayer is meant to stir up is the reality that you and your child have a place in a world that is deeply loved by God. We begin our journey with the love of God because where you begin the story and the direction that you point the story really dictates the kind of story that you're telling. So often I meet people who grew up in a context where the story of God and the story of life with God begins as a story of a mistake that brought separation from God. So many people begin the story in Genesis chapter 3, but the story begins in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, where we read this beautiful poetry that is meant to push back against the prevailing narratives that were circulating in the ancient Near East at the time that Genesis was written. So if you were living in the ancient Near East around the time that Genesis emerges as a text and as a story, the way that most people would have been viewing the gods is that the gods were all about war and destruction, and that the gods created the humans in order to serve the needs of the gods. I mean, this was the predominant narrative. In fact, there's one story about a god named Marduk who slays another god, a female god whose name was Tiamat. And then he created the world out of Tiamat's dead body. I know this is like really weird stuff, But you have to remember that these texts were written thousands and thousands of years ago in a time where this is how people thought. And I sort of wonder how this story shaped how people thought about themselves. I wonder what sort of impact this kind of story had on people. A story where creation was the result of violence, and the whole purpose of humankind was to serve as slave labor for the gods. And then another narrative comes along, a set of poems that we have in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 that lay out a different vision for a different God. Not a God who creates through violence, and not a story about slaves created to serve the gods, but rather it's a story about a God who, like a dove, hovers over the chaos just before creation and begins to speak such beautiful things into that chaos and woos that chaos into creation. And then this new God, who we read later on in the story, is a God named Yahweh. This God just keeps speaking into the chaos, creating beautiful things with God's own voice, on land and in the water, in the expanse of the sky. And finally, this God creates humankind and sets the humans in the middle of all of the things that are beautiful and says to the humans, I have made all of this for you. We get a story in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 of a God who creates from love with a desire to serve and give and extend that love into the world through his creation. The most important part of the story is that God loves so many things.